All right, welcome back. This is Learning Unit 2, the Russian and Central Asian realm. So this is a map of our realm, and it's dominated by the super large country of Russia. Also included are a handful of other countries, namely it's Russia and Central Asia. And Central Asia consists of the Stan countries. They all have names that end in Stan, like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and so on here. And these are sort of right in the middle of Asia, so it's called Central Asia. And there's three other countries too. It's a little harder to see, but you have Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan here in the Caucasus Mountains. It's a little easier to see here. This is the Russia separated into different zones, different regions. And in pink here is Central Asia. And Transcaucasia over here in purple, this is where you have these three countries of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and then a handful of other countries that are in Central Asia. One thing I'll note is that the Transcaucasian countries and Central Asian countries were, along with Russia and a handful of other Eastern European countries, part of the Soviet Union at one time. So that's one reason why these stands are included with Russia as well as these Transcaucasian countries, because they were all part of the same political entity at one time. More on that later. One other thing I'll highlight here are the Ural Mountains. And if you recall from the Europe lecture, that one thing about the Ural Mountains is that they're the traditional dividing line between Europe in the west and Asia in the east. And we'll see that division. And these Ural Mountains are inside Russia itself. And we're going to see that there is a real divide in Russia between its European side. There's most of the people live on the European side. And the other side of the Ural, which is Asia and generally called Siberia. Not as many people in Siberia. Okay, so these are the realms. It's divided into some different ones, but generally we consider this area Siberia on the other side of the Caucasus. And this is the Russian core, the European side where most of the people live. And then we have Central Asia and Transcaucasia. We're going to talk about that separately. And we're also going to discuss Eastern Europe here in this lecture, because to help understand what Eastern Europe, it's helpful to understand a little bit of the history of Russia and the Soviet Union first, and a little bit about the Cold War. Okay, these are some concepts, ideas, and terms that would be useful to know. Some of the first ones have a lot to do with the physical geography, and there's some other things that we're going to be talking about as we go. Okay, just a geographic overview. This is showing the physical landscapes of Europe, and there was a feature we talked about called the North European lowland, often also called the European plain. And that extends from the United Kingdom and well beyond Europe into Russia. So when we look at a map of the physical regions of Russia here, this Russian plain is actually an extension of that European plain, or North European lowland, as our book calls it. That extends well into Russia. If you've watched a few of the preview videos that I had of the YouTube videos, they talk about that Northern European plain being sort of a funnel through which people have attacked Russia in the past. So that's part of its geography. This is from a different textbook showing the North European plain extending from Europe out into Russia. That extension into Russia is called the Russian plain. The Russian plain is really the part of Russia that extends up into the Ural Mountains. It is really a physical extension of Europe that extends into the country of Russia. So part of Russia is actually European, part of it is in Asia. When you get past the Ural Mountains into what's generally we might call Siberia, you get into a much more remote and difficult physical environment of swampy forests, rugged mountains, and very extremely cold temperatures. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But first, let's talk a little bit about the population of Russia, and let's include the Central Asian realms as well. Okay, let me skip ahead a little. I'm a little out of order. First off, in terms of physical size, you should know that Russia is the largest country in the world. It's nearly double the size of the United States, which is a big country itself. However, in terms of population, Russia is roughly half the size of the United States. It has about 144 million, where the US has over 300 million. So it's actually less than half the population of the United States. The next most populated country in this realm is down here. One of the stands, Uzbekistan, has 30 million people. And the reason why I want to highlight that is that note that this population of Uzbekistan is far smaller than the large country of the realm, which is Russia. So as a reminder, we had a term in the beginning of the course called polycentric versus monocentric geographic realms. Europe was a good example of a polycentric, where the countries were more or less equal, where in this realm, Russia is clearly the dominant country. So this would be a monocentric geographic realm because of the dominance of Russia. Going back a couple of steps, most of that population, however, is concentrated on the European side. So the Ural Mountains are roughly around here. Most of the population represented by the dots are in this area here in Western Russia. On the European side of the Ural Mountains, or west of the Ural Mountains. A little bit of concentration in Central Asian places, but most of the population resides here. This is around the city of Moscow, the capital, and the area around it. If we look at transportation links, they're all, they radiate out of the city of Moscow. A lot of transportation corridors throughout this western part again, with some rail lines that extend into the east, but for the most part, the population is concentrated in the west. And in this map of the Russian regions, again, that's why they call this the Russian core, because this is where the population is really concentrated in Russia. One other population trend I want to mention is that recently, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we're going to more on that later, but the modern country of Russia has seen a reduction of population from the east. So in these far eastern provinces, their population has been reduced by 21%, and here in Siberia by 9%, less and less, and population is growing in the more European part. During the Soviet Union era, which we'll discuss what that is, the government had more control over where people live. People actually were incentivized or forced to live further into Siberia. And as those incentives and power of the government to control where people live has been reduced over time, the population has tended to shift over to the European side. And I'll also show a video that talks about the future of countries that discusses this population change in Russia. One other aspect of population I want to discuss is disparities of wealth in modern Russia. That in the post-Soviet era, there used to be a communist economy or socialist economy where wealth was spread more evenly amongst the population. And as it's moved into the post-Soviet era, there's greater disparity between the rich and the poor. So if we look at how wealth is spread in the United States versus Russia, these are categories of wealth like less than 10,000, 10,000 to 100,000, 100,000 to a million, more than a million. In the United States, you have a fair amount of people in each one of these categories. In Russia, it is less so, that most people are concentrated in the poorest category with very few in the richest category. But some of the people in that richest category are extremely rich, that you have sort of a handful of extremely rich people in Russia and then a large amount of the population that lives in poverty. And because of that, even though there is, there's oil and some other natural resources of wealth in Russia, overall the population is quite poor, that it falls within some of the poorer categories. In fact, The average wealth of the average Russian is less than the average person in India, which India sometimes is stereotyped as a relatively poor country, but truth be told, on average, people in India have more wealth than your average person in Russia. Now, where the wealth comes from, a large part is from mineral resources. Russia has a huge land size that includes a lot of oil deposits. So Russia is among the top 3 oil producers in the world. The top 3 are Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Russia is generally number 2 or 3 on that list, depending on who's on top. And much of the Russian economy depends on that oil revenue. And that can be problematic because, as in Venezuela, fluctuations in the price of oil can send shockwaves through their economy as well. In addition to oil, natural gas is a major export of Russia. In fact, there are major pipelines that carry natural gas into much of Europe, including countries like Ukraine and Germany. And the dependence on Europe of that natural gas also gives Russia leverage over many countries. So, for example, in past conflicts with Ukraine, Russia has been known to shut off the gas at times to try to exert leverage over Ukraine, which needs that in order to for people not to freeze. It's necessary to warm houses and things like that. And we've seen this already, but I'll just kind of highlight a regional view of the Russian Central Asian realm. We'll kind of treat Siberia as one big area. We will concentrate on the Central Asian realm, Transcaucasia, and we'll also highlight countries of Eastern Europe, especially those that were part of the Soviet Union at one time.